All right, we're starting again with this second piece lecture. And there are these two sources for this lecture. And I'm going to start with this first section, sacrifice. Okay, so at this point I will remind myself to run the slide that has the list of what I'm going to talk about in this lecture. The 4 points I'm going to talk about. In the sacrifice, one of the idea of sacrificing, of there being a sacrificial person or even whole people sometimes is very old, and it's been looked at extensively by different people. If you're interested in this idea, the best place to start is with a book by a French anthropologist named René Girard, with a book called Violence and the Sacred. And Girard is very, well, it's sort of the classic in contemporary early postmodern literature about what the sacrifice means, and so on. More recently, that territory has been furthered by Giorgio Agamben, who's an Italian philosopher, really, and his book Homo Sacer is the next thing you would read. It's a very particular book. I mean, this is not easy reading. Girard is actually quite easy. You know, it's like much anthropology. It's like, oh, it's really interesting stuff. Anyway, so to get Colin's story, you need some background. When don't you need background to get a story? And which is a good point, I think, about a lot of literature, where, you know, when I taught first year, when I went for the first time to teach, and I was given a first year class to teach, my students were so upset at how much they had to know to understand the books we were reading. You know, it made them mad. You know, that they were like, how come we don't know about this? And I'm like, well, that's why you're here. You know, you're here to learn. We were reading Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. And a great deal of the book is a sort of satirical gesture towards Moby Dick, in a useful sort of way. I mean, it's not just for kicks. I mean, there's a reason for it, but you have to, you know, it's tough for an 18-year-old to come into class and be told that, you know, they didn't actually get a useful education in high school. What were they doing that whole time? It's like, well, you know, keep them busy, but not necessarily being taught to think, which, anyway, I shall not go into that discussion. We can have it in person, quote unquote, in person, if you like. So the first story, there are two stories in the sacrifice. And the first story is about a king. And this king had this amazing looking wife, and who was this sort of the be-all and the end-all of women. And she was stolen by another king who also wanted this woman, right? So, because it's guys, you know, guys want other guys, gals as possessions. Okay, so the deal the first king made was that if his wife, wherever, this beautiful woman, amazing, wherever stolen, the whole country would go to war. And, well, okay, so she was stolen, right? So the king called everybody together and said, we're going to go to war. That was our deal. And they were like, oh, man, you know, what a lousy deal. Okay, fine, all right. And so they had to get ready to sail, basically. So at this point, the people involved in having to go to war in this terrible deal that they made chose a military commander. And the military commander got everybody ready to ship out. And you gotta get ready. You gotta get ready to sail, and you gotta get ready to row, because this is before coal power and steam power and all other kinds of fancy power we have now. What they had was human labor and the wind, and they weren't very good with the wind because they didn't understand how to rig sails in a complex way. Blah blah blah. So they needed a lot of wind. Otherwise, they couldn't cross the ocean and have this war. And for some reason, which is unclear, the military commander had pissed off the person who was in charge of the wind. And so she looked down and said, "No wind for you," basically. And he was like, "Oh shit! I'm in charge here. I got to make this happen." So he went to the oracle, the priests, and said, "Can you please tell me what the goddess wants me to do? Whatever it is, I'll do it." And they're like, "Okay." But in the Greek, because this is a Greek story, in Greek stories, it's dangerous to ask the gods what is it they want. It's a dangerous thing. In general, it's not a good idea to ask. In a Greek story, when you see a god, you should go the other direction as quickly as possible and hide somewhere. Anyway, so he has to make the same thing happen. So the priest go and talk to the goddess, and the goddess basically says, "I need a sacrifice." And he's like, "Yeah, fine, I'll sacrifice it. What do you need me to, like, burn one of my houses or burn a bunch of bulls or, And she's like, "No, it's a big sacrifice." He's like, "Yeah, what? I can't think of it." And she's like, "Kill one of your daughters." And he's like, "Ooh, that's more than I planned on." And it turns out that the terms of this sacrifice were to be that the daughter had to agree to it and had to understand that she was a sacrifice. So she had to willingly go to her own death. And so at this point, the military commander is like, "Well, it has to be." So he goes to her and says, "Sorry, honey, your time is up." But you have to agree to it, right? I can't put you in chains and drag you off, and nobody else can do it. I have to do it. And she says, "What kind of father are you? Like, this is terrible. What a stupid plan." And he says, "Yeah, I don't disagree with you, but at the same time, I've got my job here, and I've been told by my king to make this happen." And so she says, "Okay, forget it." And so she goes away. And then she starts to think about it, and she thinks, "Wait a second. Maybe this is why I'm alive. Maybe I was put on this planet, put into this narrative, basically, to serve this particular purpose. This is what I must do." So she accepts her fate, and she returns to her father, and they kill her. And the winds start to blow, and the ships go out on the ocean, and they go to the city, which is where this knockout gal is, and they fight an 11-year-long war for her back, basically, to get her back, not just her back. And the 11-year-long war, we used to say, how can you conceive of this? But actually, we've had 3 11-year-long wars in the last 50 years. Started by the West, perpetrated by the West, kept up by the West. So we can. In fact, 11 years is starting to look like small potatoes compared to, say, 17 years in Iraq, give or take. Still, 19 years in Afghanistan for the Americans. It's a long time. So at the end of that particular story, after 11 years, the city is finally breached. The city walls are finally breached because of the Trojan horse. And the Greeks get in and kill all the Trojans, and they kill all the boys, all the boy children, and they raze the city. They sack the city, which means they rape all the women. and the girls, and kill anybody they like and take whatever they want because they've been fighting for a long time and they haven't made any money. And then they go home to Greece, and all is well. That's that particular story. So, of these characters, the original king is Menelaus, and his wife, who he wins in a contest of skill, that is, in a like a duel sort of a match, a physical match, is Helen, who becomes Helen of Troy, but is not Trojan particularly, but she is the famous Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, whose face launched 1,000 ships and so on, as it's often said, quoted. And the military leader who has been put in charge of the fleet is Agamemnon, and his daughter is Iphigenia. So the play that this all comes up in, you have to know the sort of background for that, but the play is one of these typical, I mean, these Greek plays are tight, they're short little plays, and they pack a huge wallop. The play is called Iphigenia and Aulis by Euripides. Is that right? Is it Euripides? Yeah, Euripides. And it was first played, we think, in 406 BCE, that is before the Common Era. Okay? So this is the first piece of background you need to understand to read Susan Collins' story, Iphigenia. Not so much to read it as to get more out of it, really. Okay.